All right, so how many of you are here to learn how to start vegetables from seed? Okay, how many for flowers? Okay, how many for native things? Okay, how many for all of the above? Great. Okay, hopefully I can cover all of that. But think in your mind of specific varieties or species that you might be interested in. And at the end, we'll start talking about specific things. How about that? We'll talk in general, broad strokes. Hello, Laura Parker. Oh, wait, I just said that on a YouTube recording. Whoops. Scratch that. Scratch that name. Anyway, and for those of you that don't have seats, feel free to sit on the ground or pick up a pot. Sit on an upturned pot. So what we're going to talk about might seem a little frightening because I'm going to say a lot of, and Steve too, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. But really, think about it. How long has nature been starting seeds? Forever, right? Okay, so since the world began, since plants began, they've been starting seeds. So we can do this, right? Like I can tell you things to help you be successful, but make sure you experiment and remember that it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay to fail, and it's okay to not do everything I say. So we're going to go off of these handouts. So if you didn't grab one, you might want to grab one. First of all, highest success rate is by reading your seed packets. I can't tell you how often I don't read my seed packets and then I regret it afterwards. Because most seeds have specific needs. And so when we read the seed packets, we won half the battle already. So make sure you do that. Buy the right kind of seeds. Steve and I were just talking about how often at work people tell him, I can't get a tomato to grow. I can't get green. All I ever get is green tomatoes. Can some of you nod your heads that this happens to you? Half of that battle is picking the right variety too. So if there are certain varieties, in fact, Steve went and grabbed some from Seed Savers Exchange that you can buy here at Warner's. And Siberian tomato has less days to maturity. If you start with something like that, then you're going to have greater success of getting those ripe red little Cadillac fruits.
How many growing days do we have of
Flag, well, you're going to talk about that later.
Right?
Yeah, it's in here, right here where we talk about season extension. It depends, right? Like some people, they only have 70 days in Flagstaff. And we used to live in Doney Park for how many years? 13 years. We only had 70 days because we were in a little cold spot. Some people in Doney Park have 110 days, right? So it just depends on where you live. Okay, so quit interrupting me. You'll get your turn. Isn't it always that way? All right, so something that's bred for, and then another thing is, those big seeds that take forever to germinate because they're so big. Soak them like 24 hours or even a few hours will even make a difference before you put them in the ground. You're cutting your germination time by like 1 to 2 days by just soaking those little puppies, big puppies in the seed world, I guess, really. And then as a general rule, you'll want to plant those, and one of the things that is the main reason that your seeds don't come up, there are two big reasons and I always helped all my kids in their elementary schools in their classroom start seeds, and these were the two biggest problems, and it's not unusual. It's not just a kid problem. But we plant them too deep, and we don't keep the moisture consistent. We let them dry out, or we let them soak up, or we get them too soggy. Usually we let them dry out, and we don't keep it consistent that way. But when you plant them, the general rule is those seeds need to be 2 times in the soil, 2 times as deep as they are wide. So there are some really tiny seeds. I don't know if some of you have tried to plant petunia seeds or Johnny Jump Ups or Lysianthus. Some of these seeds are poppies, they're so tiny. So, and then some of them actually need light to germinate. So some of them have to be right on top of the soil. So you have to be careful and pay attention to those things in your seed packet, or the great Google can always tell you per seed too, right, what you can do. The other thing is you need to stagger your seeds when you are starting them. So all these things that we're talking about are starting seeds before you get them in the ground, right? I mean, that's okay to direct seed some things, but sometimes it's just easier to get them in the ground because of our short growing season, right? So eggplants are one of them, onions. A lot of those times we want to start those 8 to 10 weeks earlier than when we're going to plant them out in the ground. So we need to look at a calendar and figure that back like in Flagstaff, the average last frost date, this is also in your section, so I am stealing some of your stuff, is June 15th. June 10th to June 15th are the average last frost dates. So you're going to count back 10 weeks to things for eggplants, 8 to 10 weeks, because those are not cold hardy at all, and they're really little weak sauce, and they will freeze if we get a frost. We'll talk about some things you can do to put them in the ground a little early, though, too. All right, so what are some things that we can, what are some varieties that we can start early? Most of these are vegetables here that we're talking about, though there are some flowers. Eggplants, onions, tomatillos, tomatoes, peppers, herbs, a lot of herbs you can start early, some flowers, some, not sunflowers, but some flowers. Leafy greens, cucumbers, brassicas, pole beans, melons, and winters. Now, that's not to say that you can't do other things. These are just the ones that really here in Flagstaff in our cold climate, we make sure that we do. And then there are some that aren't recommended. You still can do them. They're just a little trickier to get in the ground at the right time without stunting their growth. I know a lot of people that start these early, too. Corn, bush beans, summer squash, grains, carrots, radishes, beets, and flowers that need stratification. Now, I have here... See, I'm going to really make this a rattly noise, so I apologize. Seeds that need stratification. And this is one technique you can do for those. And stratification means?
I don't know.
Stratification. They need some cold dormancy before that they can actually know that it's time to wake up, to germinate. So here I have some lavender and larkspur and some eriogonum. I can never say that flower. Anyway, and I just put them in some wet paper towels, and then I fold them up, and then I put them in the fridge. And then after about a couple weeks, maybe sometimes even a week, depending on the variety, I check them to see if they're starting to sprout. And then usually with the lavender, it takes a whole month. Once they start to crack open the seeds and I start to see the root, the little root tip come out, then I actually put them in substrate, and then I put them under a grow light. So there's a lot of varieties that you can trick into thinking that they're doing that. Poppies, I take poppies and I put them in their seed pots, and then I cover them with snow and let them be outside for about a week or two with the cold temperatures below freezing, and then I take them out, and then I go put them under a light and on a heat mat. That's what they need to remember that it's time. So a lot of these you can fall plant and not have to worry about this, but sometimes you just need that extra boost for some of them like lavender, they're a little harder to grow from seed, so I always do it that way. And poppies require sunlight, so do the Johnny Jump Ups that we talked about, Lisianthus. I can't think of any vegetables that need light to germinate, but if I do, I'll let you know.
What about vegetables that need cold stratification?
Are there any? I can't think of any of those either. So those of you that are here for the vegetables, it's an easier route, right?
Would you prefer questions at the end or throughout?
What would you like? Just throw them out.
Sweet peas. You didn't mention sweet peas.
Sweet peas. Sweet peas like cold, but that's you just put them in the soil and give them some light and maybe some warmth underneath. But they are pretty cold hardy, so you can plant them out early. But then they will freeze, like they won't take a hard freeze. So if it's 28 or below, you'll need to cover them. But you can start them early. Anything that's vining, you can actually start early. I brought here some cardinal climbers, and those I start early, and I start sweet peas early too. All right, so I just mentioned something about warmth underneath. So this is really important for germination. Talked about them needing cold. Some things need stratification, but then they need the warmth to really for the enzymes to kick in for growth. And so a lot of times you can either use, obviously it's getting pretty warm in here, right? So greenhouses can work for that extra warmth. We need the soil warm, not necessarily the light at first to get seeds to germinate. So they do sell heat mats here. Do you want to pull that? I can't walk with these things. These are some that we use. I use these 48-inch seed mats and then just stack them all in there on shelves in my garage. I used to have a greenhouse in our old Donny Park house. And that is a way to do it, but it is also pricey, right? Most of us don't have greenhouses. And there's a trick to learning how to use greenhouses too. You can cook your plants pretty easily, and you can dry them out a lot easier. So this is a controlled thing. So even people I know that have greenhouses use mats a lot of times to keep the soil warm. That's because most plants or most seeds need anywhere from 68 degrees to 85 degrees. And even in some cases like okra and like even radishes need 95 degrees to germinate well. So that's pretty warm soil. And I know I just said don't start radishes early, but you can do that. Just be aware that they need to go in the ground before the root starts getting too large. So they need really warm soil and to germinate. But most vegetables and plants need about 80 to 85. That's pretty normal. So you really need to try and keep it warm. The other thing I'll talk about probably in a minute is not pouring cold water right on those seedlings as you're watering them. But make sure the water is either lukewarm or room temperature so that it's not always constantly fighting to get the soil back to its warmth, right? All right, any other questions at this point? Yeah. Once the seeds emerge, then this isn't important. They actually like to be kind of cool soiled. Cool is in like 75, not huge cool. But this is to germinate, and then once they emerge, then you need that light. And we'll talk about light because light is very specific of what they need to get going. So warm soils. So the problem with warm soils is, what's all on the bottom of that? Yeah, so there's condensation. So it's a great environment for mold and algae and bacteria, right? So airflow is really important. So I actually don't use these very much. I'll use them just to warm up the soil for that first day or two, and then I take them off. Because then what happens is then I end up with mold. Now these are little dahlias. A lot of people start dahlias from tubers, but I also like to be tricky and start some from seed because it's cheaper. Hopefully all of you are here because starting seeds is so much cheaper, right? So when I say cheaper, okay. Cost effective, right? Okay. Plus I like the varieties I can get with seeds that I always can't just buy at a I won't say where we are. Somewhere. Places. Better here than Home Depot. There, that's just back on Home Depot. Better than here than Home Depot. Peat moss is a great antiseptic, so I always like to include a little peat moss. It is not very environmentally friendly, so I try to use the minimal amount of possible because it's only harvested in the northern states, so Canada areas, and it's a limited resource. So I try to use as limited as possible of that. I also sprinkle some cinnamon. But as I found this year at sea, I've been doing this for, a dozen years. And I even make mistakes. I put too much cinnamon and crusted the soil on some of my seedlings. So just do a sprinkle. If you start to see mold start to develop, give a little sprinkle of cinnamon and that can hopefully get rid of your mold. The other thing you can do is vermiculite. Vermiculite is great to put in your seed mix, but it also, thank you. You can also put a layer of that. Some people use sand as well. It's actually gypsum is what vermiculite is. And if you put a thin layer of that also helps control mold and algae growth.
The nice thing about peat moss is it's also acidic.
Yes. The nice thing about peat moss is it's also acidic. And plants like a slight acidity, and we'll talk about that, especially vegetables.
Is there a level of soil moisture that would impede the problems that you're talking about?
Yeah, and I'll have him talk about the water thing, but yeah, definitely. Soggy is not good for plants, but just spongy wet is kind of what they like. Like a wet sponge where you don't want it to drip out, but just enough that you can feel that springiness in the water.
Or wouldn't that still create fungus?
Yes. So if I touched it like this and my hand came back a little bit wet, that's what you want. And so that's a perfect environment still for fungus and bacteria, right? So that's why I'm telling you. For this, yeah, because all these seeds need to suck up all that water, right? And they need to soften their seed coats. Some seed coats you've probably seen on some seeds are really thick, right? So they need to suck all that up, so they need it. So is that what you're asking? So that it's the same.
I'm just trying to understand how to balance moisture in the soil and fungus that would develop from it.
It's the hardest thing for me. It's a hard dance.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's the same idea.
It is. It's the same ideal conditions for both, so that's why I'm saying, use cinnamon, use vermiculite, get a soil that has something, and most of all, airflow, right? If you can get airflow like in our greenhouse, it was great. I didn't have a big of as a mold problem as I do with growing them under grow lights and on heat mats, because there was more airflow going through. I had ventilation, and that would go. However, if you don't have that, and most of us don't, then you just have to figure out ways to keep it breezy in there, whether it's just you coming through, or set up a fan for a little bit if you really start to get a huge mold problem. We'll talk about it, but there's something that happens called damping off if you get too much mold. And you've probably, have any of you started seeds and see all of a sudden you have this great seedling and then it just flops over? That's damping off, and I spelled it wrong in there. It's actually not dampening off, it's a damping off. And damping off happens when it's too wet in there, or you have mold. It's actually a fungus that'll happen that knock it over.
You can also sterilize your seed starting mix.
Yeah.
Kill anything in there. I don't like doing that because there's also good microbes in there you don't want to kill. So it's just find that balance of what works for you and just experimenting.
Is there any kind of barrier that could go through the layer so that the bottom half of the soil will, the moisture that you want, allowing the seed to grow, and then the barrier would kind of give you that depth of bed that you want with the dryer on top?
I haven't seen anything like that. Usually when you're doing barrier like that, it's to prevent like weed growth and that sort of thing.
But it would also prevent fungus if your soil on top was drier than the soil underneath, which is benefiting the seed.
So the problem with that, though, is most seeds need to be able to get through, and so then you're limiting them. So it can be tricky, but it's also not as hard as it sounds. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, that was my thought.
Organic soil still would have beneficial and negative bacteria and fungus in it. So you can sterilize it. Like Steve said, I don't know if you could hear him. He said you can sterilize your soil, and a lot of people do that. We don't like getting rid of the good stuff that can be in it. So I really just use cinnamon. When I start to see a problem, I shake some cinnamon on it. I just don't need to get so crazy with it like I did this year. That's all. All right, and then here I included a few in the handout, a few soil mixes, seed starting mixes that have been tried and true for a few people I know. However, some of those might look a little intimidating to you. You can always just buy a bag of potting soil. I am never very picky about it. I just do it by texture. I get a big barrel or one of those big concrete mix black plastic things you can get at Home Depot, I said that word again. At certain hardware stores. And then you can put the potting soil in, and then I mix a little perlite, a little vermiculite, sand. Sand's a great substrate too. And then some little nutrients like some kelp meal, or I'll put a little bit of fertilizer, and then humate. Humate, we'll talk about it in a second when we get to the soils. But I mix that all in, just a little bit of those. I don't really look at 1 part this, 20 parts of this, but I just do it by feel, and then I mix it up. So if this intimidates you, don't worry about it. But I'm giving you those just in case. Is there a way to open those doors so it's not so hot in here? Yeah, they really did. They wanted us to be cooked. Anyway, so does anyone have any questions on soil? That I'm not going to go over all these mixes. In the back, and then you, Leslie.
Lots of the seed starting kind of kits that you buy come with those little discs.
Yeah.
Are those useful?
Yes, and that's straight core. That works totally fine. So core is just shredded coconut, which is a lot more environmentally friendly. However, it doesn't really have a lot of nutrition. So if you're going to start them that way, as soon as you get those little seedlings popped up, you might need to supplement with some other things in there. Because seeds actually, it's like a baby with its own packed lunch. It's got a lunchbox, is what some seed biologists talk about. Because they have everything they need to grow and start, and before we even see that seed crack open, there's a lot going on with that seed. All that endosperm and all that in there is going to feed it for as long as it needs until it gets to start growing. So once it starts to establish roots, the cotyledon is out, and then the true leaves start to form. That's when it needs help with the nutrition. So that's when you'll need to take care of
I
it.
say about those though that we have used them in the past. We don't use them anymore. We didn't really care for them too much.
But when you're starting out, it's a great way to start. Like these little kits, it's a good thing to start. It's also can get pricey.
So when you add the nutrients you said into it, like
You can shake it in. You could do it as a liquid fertilizer as well. You can make it into a liquid. You can also just, because they are just little discs, you have room around to pack in extra soil, and you could do that mix where you have various, like the humate and the kelp and some other things in there, and then put that around it too. Yeah. Leslie, what was your question?
I always use seed starting mix, but what happens if you just use potting soil?
Potting, so there's no seed starting mix I could find here. I'm sure there is somewhere, but I didn't find it. Potting soil's fine. Even garden soil. What you want to look for is you want to make sure there aren't huge, big chunks. I mean, even I know people that just, like the one for Siskiyou Seeds, Don Tipping, he just uses his compost, his aged manure. That's fine. You just want to make sure you don't have big, huge chunks that are getting away those seeds so that they can't emerge, right? So that's the only thing. And then potting soil would be fine. Just mix it with other things. So it's a light you want something light, fluffy, and arable, right? Arable. All right, I'm tired of talking. Do you want to talk a little bit?
Whatever you want me to do.
Come talk about light.
Light or heat?
Yeah, light and heat.
We're going along your what are we doing here?
Well, I kind of jumped the paper. So talk about light and heat together.
All right. Do I really have to hold this?
Yeah.
Can y'all hear me without this microphone? Dang it. All right. I hate using these things. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about warmth. Like Jackie said, most seeds need like 65 to 85 degrees to germinate, and it really depends upon the variety that determines what that temperature is. You can go to the Google machine, and there's some great charts out there that will show temperature ranges and then germination times for various seeds. So usually what will happen is if it's too cold, it may not germinate, or it may germinate a lot slower. So you take like a tomato seed, which really likes it to be a lot warmer. It may take 2 or 3 weeks at a colder temperature for it to germinate, versus at its ideal temperature, it could take 2 to 3 days. So it's just, learning what that right balance of temperature is for those seeds that you're starting. Using things like Jackie showed, the heat mats, those are great. We use those a lot. If you do have a greenhouse, greenhouses are great too. Like we had to open the doors in here because it's really warm. You can see how warm these things heat up, and that's not with the sun beating straight down on it. So they can be dangerous too. It's one of those things where everybody in Flagstaff thinks like, oh, if I can just get a greenhouse, it'll fix all of my problems. And I'll promise you that it will create more problems for you at the beginning than it will fix, because you're going to learn how to use it. When we first started building greenhouses, we cooked a lot of stuff. The other thing about greenhouses too, most of them, unless you've got an active heating in it, if it's a passive greenhouse, when the temperatures drop down at night, the temperature in that greenhouse is going to drop down to the ambient temperature too. So you got to think about that as well. We did used to start all of our seeds in the greenhouse. It was a smaller greenhouse that was attached to the south side of the house. And what I did is I put a thermostat and a little garden heater in there. So at night, I didn't want the temperature to drop below, say, 75 degrees. Then that heater would kick on. All right? It was pretty effective. It worked pretty well. Now, if you don't want to do any energy inputs into that, which I know a lot of gardeners don't want to do more energy inputs than they need to, then what you're left with is what we used to do too, was you move them in and out of the greenhouse. So the nightly routine was go out and get all the seedlings, move them into the garage or move them into the house where it's warmer, and then in the morning move them back out. So those are a couple of options when it comes to greenhouses. Did I see a hand go up somewhere?
What type of heater at night are you talking about?
It was just like a little, I got it from, what was it, Farm Tech or something like that, one of the online gardening places. It was just a little outdoor space heater that was designed for stuff like that. So you can get a variety of sizes. But what I would encourage, if you're going to do that, just make sure you put it on a thermostat so it doesn't get too hot, because you can get some heaters that'll heat that greenhouse up really hot even at night, and it doesn't get too cold. You want to have it in that nice ideal temperature range. A couple of other things you can try to do too. Incandescent light bulbs put out quite a bit of heat. Years ago, I built these sprouting trays that we still use today, and I put a bunch of insulation on the bottom side of them, but then I took incandescent rope lights and wove them all along the floor of it, and then put plastic on top of that. And what we do is we take our seed trays like this, set them right down into that, and just plug those in. And surprisingly, it keeps the soil at about 75 degrees even at night when it was getting down to below freezing. So there's a number of different things you can try to do. LEDs don't put out as much heat as incandescent bulbs do. I know it's kind of hard to find incandescent rope lights these days, or even incandescent like Christmas lights or something like that. Everybody's shifted to LEDs. The nice thing about LEDs is they use a lot less power than do the incandescent bulbs. they also don't put as much heat. So a number of things you can try too. There's also these guys, these are heat cables. So if you had a bed that you wanted to just plant directly into, you can weave these heat cables throughout the soil in that bed, and then it just plugs in, and you can warm up the soil that way. Again, I would say you can get a thermostat that sticks into the soil, so you can really control that soil temperature, so it doesn't get too hot, it doesn't get too cold. Those are a couple of ideas for keeping the soil warm. But it's key for germinating them to keep the soil warm, so that you get them to germinate quickly, so then you can start actually growing stuff. Anything else on temperature? Is that okay? Well, I guess with temperature too, we started talking about like the number of growing days that we have in Flagstaff, right? And it depends upon where you live. Like Jackie said, it's anywhere from 70 to 100, 105 days, and it's all dependent upon where you live. Like she said, where we lived in Donny Park before, we had 70 days if we were lucky. Where we live today, we've got 120 maybe? 110? We got a lot more where we live today now. So it all just depends upon where you're at. So kind of get to know your microclimate. We have a ton of microclimates in this area. Really pay attention to your temperatures around your house. Pay attention to when things freeze, when they don't freeze. Some of the things, I guess it's technically in the season extension, but we'll talk about it. If you wanted to start your seeds outside, you can do that by doing things like, using some of these techniques we said, using heat cables or something like that to keep that soil warm. You're also going to want to keep them warmer at night. So using something like a frost cloth to cover everything up. This also is our nightly and morning routine, is covering everything up with frost cloth and then uncovering it in the morning. This doesn't specify in this bag, but when you buy them online, there's a brand called Agribon. Comes in different weights. And the different weight Agribons will give you, the heavier weight will give you more protection at night. Doesn't give you a ton. I mean, it gets up to like 7 degrees of protection it'll give you. So, you could drop down to, say, 28, 27 with a really heavy Agribon and still protect your plants in there. The drawback to the heavier ones is you get less light transmission through them. So if you wanted to leave them covered with that Agribon all the time, less light's going to come through, and that's going to impair the growth of those plants. So you might have to uncover that. The lighter frost cloths, more light comes through, but it doesn't give you as much protection as do the heavier ones. So again, experiment with them. These are also great for season extension, where you've got those tomatoes that are just about to turn red, and you looked at the weather, and it's supposed to freeze that night. These are great. You cover those up with these, and you'll be able to get those tomatoes to turn red. Because the problem we have here in Flagstaff is, it seems like in mid-September-ish there'll be a frost, and then there won't be another frost for like a month, which is just frustrating as a gardener. But that's where it's also key to pay attention to your weather. Really good gardeners are really good weather experts too, because you know exactly what the weather's doing. You pay attention to it constantly. We've got a weather station at the house, and I've got an app on the phone. I can check it always, and I'm always looking at it. How cold is it going to get tonight? How hot is it going to get today? I'm an engineer. Nothing's wrong with that. I like numbers. I like numbers better than I like people. I'm an engineer, right? Amen. Anyway, so those are some things you can do. I kind of got into the season extension there. But when it comes to light, so Jackie mentioned, when they're first starting to germinate, they don't necessarily need light unless it's some of those flower seeds that require light to germinate. However, once they do germinate and you're starting to see that growth coming out of the soil, they're going to need light. Right? They have a little bit of lunch in that seed to help them to start growing, but once they emerge out of that soil, that lunch is pretty well eaten up. They need to start photosynthesizing and creating their own energy. And to photosynthesize, they need light. So a couple of things that you can do to use light. One of the things not to do, don't start them in your windowsill. Usually the light is too diffuse, and you get these really leggy plants that kind of get all spindly, and they grow toward the light. Those plants aren't going to do very well, because as soon as you put them outside, they're just going to wither in the direct sunlight. So don't do that one. A couple of things that you can do, and we've got some examples here. Where's that big light over there? Yeah. All right, so there are LED lights, there are fluorescent lights, there's a whole variety of grow lights that are out there. Yeah, no, I haven't gotten out yet. So a couple of things we'll talk about here. I've used grow lights. So I have a bunch of citrus trees in the house, and citrus trees are really demanding when it comes to light.
Also an obsession for him.
So, and so I've got a bunch of different grow lights I've tried out over the years. We also use grow lights for starting our seeds because we start our seeds in the garage. We don't have a greenhouse anymore. If we still had that greenhouse, we'd probably start them in the greenhouse. That's probably the best because you're getting that natural sunlight through that greenhouse to start them, and they like that the best. And that'll we'll get to talking about hardening off, but that'll help harden them off as soon as they emerge, being exposed to that direct sunlight. But some of the things you can try, there's that big light right there, and that's got a big 125 watt fluorescent bulb in there. Now, most people today have shifted to things like these LED lights. You can see, number one, they're a heck of a lot smaller, and they put out a lot more light. And one of the benefits of these is that, a couple of benefits. Number one, they don't use as much power as the fluorescent lights do, so you can save on that. They are a little bit more expensive than the fluorescent lights are, but that cost savings pays off over time, and they have come down in price over the years. The other thing is obviously the size. The other thing is the intensity of the energy of the light coming out of it. So typically with your fluorescence, that energy really dissipates. So you got to kind of put it closer down to the plants. With these LEDs, they're pretty intense. So you want to keep those like 18 to 24 inches above the plants. If you put them down close to the plants like you would a fluorescent light, you'll burn up the plants. So just things to be aware of when it comes to those lights. You can also just go to the unnamed hardware store and buy just a regular shop light. Which they don't sell anymore? Oh, well. Okay, Homeco does. You can use the shop light. Yeah. You can use the shop light and with the regular bulbs in there. But with those ones, you're going to want to keep those ones super close to the plants themselves because they're not giving out that whole spectrum and intensity of light like the bulbs and the LEDs that are designed for growing. You can really delve deep into the science of all the wavelengths of the light and everything. And you know, I know a lot of the serious like cannabis growers, you know, they want this certain wavelength at this phase of growth, and they want to switch to this wavelength at this phase of growth. I'm not that particular about it. If you get a good full spectrum light, that's perfect for starting the seeds, getting to that point where then you can move them outside. But again, with the shop lights, what you want to do, bring those down really, really super close to the plants. And then as those plants grow, then you're just going to raise those shop lights up just so you keep that light intensity on them. Otherwise, just like the windowsill, they'll get really leggy trying to grow toward that light because it's just not a very intense light that comes out of those shop lights. You had a question?
You said numbers, then you answered my question by saying that you didn't feel it was a matter. But if we're talking about UV, is there a range of UV that you would say, okay, this is where I want to be, somewhere in this range? Secondly, you're talking about the LED lights. LED lights have a heat sink to dissipate the heat that they develop.
They do.
Does that heat sink help to warm the room if we had it in an area? Or does the heat sink not dissipate the heat correctly?
It doesn't dissipate it that much. I mean, I guess if you're in a really small room, you might see a slight effect, but I've never noticed any effect in the rooms where I have them.
It's a little bit, but not enough.
You can, so like that LED when I showed you, that heat sink is just that chunk of aluminum on top of it. You can put your hand on it and you can feel it, right? But other than that,
Also heat the room as well, so it has to be something that would be taken into account.
yeah, I think it's a minimal contribution.
Then last thing you mentioned was understanding your microclimate. Is there, since, like you said, you've moved from this area to another area which changed your microclimate. Is
Yep.
there some website here or that we could go to define our microclimate so that we can have a jump start on where we're going?
So that's a good question. A couple of the weather websites, like I think weather.com does it, where you can actually zoom in on your individual location of where you're at, and it'll give you a forecast local to just where you are instead of all of Flagstaff on average, which is usually out at the Pulliam Airport. So you can look for those things. The other thing you can do is what I started doing years ago was I just took a thermometer and put it out, a digital thermometer, an outdoor one, put it outside, and it was one that would store the temperatures for like 7 revolving days. And then I would just go out and I wrote them down and I put them into a spreadsheet and I tracked the whole thing and said, okay, this is what our average temperature highs and lows look like. And to really get that feel for, okay, this is what we can expect here.
I'm doing that with an RFI. Data logging into
Yep.
to be able to.
Yep.
inside and outside of the greenhouse.
Yeah. I encourage every gardener to do something like that, to really, because you can look at the data that's online that others have collected, or you can look at some of those weather websites, but it really gets down to it where we are. The microclimates are so varied. I encourage you just to figure out what yours is. And you might want to take it, and then once you understand certain areas, even on your property, you'll find that there are warm areas and cold areas on your property. And so understanding and knowing that, we've over the years learned the hard way, and some of them where we went, wow, crap, we planted that garden in what's the cold spot, when we didn't even think about trying to figure out was that a cold spot or a hot spot. And so really learning that and what your property is like can really, really help benefit you as a gardener and help you be much more successful. And then the numbers question, I just look for a full spectrum light.
Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. So if it's a full spectrum grow light, it's covering the entire range of what those plants need.
Are there full spectrum UV lights in a bulb that screw into an existing lamp?
There are. Yeah. And you can get LED ones like that too. Yep. Yeah, you can do that. So I know I saw in here they've got fluorescent ones, so you can buy fluorescent full spectrum bulbs. You can buy LED full spectrum bulbs. So there definitely are a lot of different varieties out there.
LED also, there's some manufacturers out there that have a way of adjusting the UV across the LED.
Yep.
So you can adjust that to whatever your plant needs.
Yeah, you can get those ones. I'll tell you, those ones are a lot more expensive than the one I showed you. But yeah, those are available too. And like I said, you really get into like a grow operation, and mostly in the cannabis industry, they really care about that stuff. You really get hardcore into that, then you start to care about that. But when it comes to vegetables and flowers, especially when you're just starting them and you're going to move them outside and grow them outside, then I wouldn't waste the money on trying to get an adjustable, fine-tunable wavelength, light.
That was in a whole different industry that we were
Yeah.
using that in.
Good. Anything else on light? No.
Yep, I think we're good.
Yeah, that's good. Back to you.
All right, I think we'll talk for another 10 minutes, and then we'll talk about specific species and varieties. So we'll just go over soil amendments and water really quick. So soil amendments, you've probably heard NPK, right? What does that stand for? Does anyone tell me? Nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. That's right. So that's what we focus on now, a lot of gardeners, is just those three things. But plants need more than just those three things, right? I mean, they're like us. Do we like to just eat bread? Well, if you ask my 2-year-old, that's all she would eat, right? Or back when she was a 2-year-old. But no, I mean, there's other things that we need. So here it's just a list there of different things that can add to your plants if you add a little bit. A lot of these we call them micronutrients, but they're important too. So they can just be that little bit that we put in. And I won't go into that too much, but if you go online, you can look at how much, when you think, well, how much to put in my seedling mix and how do I know? There's all kinds of mix. Everybody has their own mix online, so you can just check some out, see what works for you. But if you really are interested in it, come and see me afterwards and we can talk a little bit about what I do.
One of the nice things about finished compost is that it has all of that and all the other magical things in it too.
Yeah, like a whole microcosm of
and all kinds of stuff.
Yep.
When you say finished compost, do you mean compost that you buy in a bag, or you go search for your own compost?
Or make your own.
So making your own compost or buying it.
So finished compost, when it's finished, it's got that really dark black look to it. It feels nice and fine. It smells really earthy. It doesn't have still chunks of food in there and things like that. It's not me. Frank Branham is.
Yeah, in a couple of weeks, Frank will be here
Yeah.
doing it, and Frank's awesome at
Yeah,
it.
he's
In
great at
fact,
compost.
he has even learned how to compost pine needles amazingly.
Which
So
isn't that hard.
I always thought it was hard
It's not
until
hard.
Frank just proved me wrong.
No.
So come back. What's that? Endless source. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about water. The number one best way to water your seedlings is actually from the top down. So that's the cool thing about these trays, though you have to buy these trays and they don't last forever, is that they have that extra layer there that you can put water in and then they go up, right? The water goes through. Capillary action comes up and the water comes up. So that is a great way, especially if you're using really, really little seeds that you don't want to wash away. That's not always feasible. Oh, we didn't talk about containers. I just zoomed right over containers. We'll go back to that one in a sec. Doing that is a great way. And then with these, you could actually fill up from the bottom. using a water can like that with just a spout. Or there's another way, if that's just not feasible for you to do it, because we don't want to buy a bunch of more plastic. Some of us, a lot of times, we want to use whatever we have on hand, and I'll talk about containers in a second. Another option, hey, look, I found another green one. It's right there. Are these things, and it is more plastic, but they're cheaper, and they last you forever. And you just put them on a soda bottle or a water bottle, and then they fit right on something like this. So you can repurpose plastics that maybe your friend used or that your kid had. And then they water without it being a huge just wash away thing. It's just a nice little low sprinkle. I think, Lonnie, can I use these? Is that? Yeah, sure. Okay. You want to put that on there and we can show what that looks like?
That's the right size. That's too thick.
Excuse me, did you just say it's better to water from the top down?
Bottom down. But if you have to water from the top, don't use something that's going to wash away the seeds.
And I understand, but I was misunderstanding. I
Yeah.
have hearing aids, so it's kind of-
Sure. Well, and I'm kind of
She did say
scattered.
top down. It's bottom up.
Did I?
Yes.
Explain bottom down.
Bottom down. So you're going to fill up your tray. Why didn't you correct me earlier
I
then?
don't know.
You're so good at correcting me usually.
Correct you.
He did an excellent job of.
Yeah, that's too. This
Keep
size
his
is
mouth
not
shut.
right.
It's not right? Never mind. So if you put water in here, then it would, but through capillary action, that would be from bottom up, right? So that's what I meant to say, is that's the best way to do it, because then you're soaking the water and not washing away your seeds, right? Or messing with those sweet little roots that are trying to just grab hold.
And a lot of plants don't like to be top watered.
And that also adds to a lot of your mold buildup, right, too.
So are you saying that leaves, I'm not a gardener, I've
Sure.
never been a gardener. Are you saying that leaves are for the sole purpose of absorbing sunlight and not absorbing any water?
They can absorb water too, yes. But roots, that's the roots' job, right? To bring in nutrients and water. And so we want to get the water down where the roots are every time for any plant, not even just seedlings, but everything. But, go ahead.
If you're watering from bottom up, do you leave it in there till it all absorbs, or you guys take it out? What?
I leave it in until it absorbs. And if, you know how we talked about, like, if you touch it and you still have that little bit of moisture on your hand, then that's just right. But if it's starting to get soggy, then yeah, remove that rest of that water. Take that out of the tray. Take either your seedlings out of a tray, like I use even, I'll mix soil in those concrete mix buckets, but I'll also water if I have something like this that doesn't have a bottom on it to water. And then once it's wet enough, then I remove it. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions? I really kind of flubbed that one. But I love these things, and they're really easy. You can buy them anywhere. Online at places we won't mention here, but you can get them almost anywhere, and they're like $5 for like 20. And then I just hang on to them year after year so that I can water seedlings that way with bottles, and I reuse the bottles too.
Good question.
I have a question.
So could you clarify about that little thing?
Sure.
Because if you're filling the tray with water, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, but sometimes you just need to water, say, the top. If it's dry and capillary action's not working fast enough, or if the corners aren't getting watered, or if you just have a container that you cannot water it from the bottom up, for whatever reason, these work well because then they don't wash away the seeds. Does that make sense? Like this is option number 2 if you can't do like the first best thing. I don't even know what they're called. I just call them water nozzles for seedlings, and things pop up at magical sites that deliver to your door. Yes.
Is the bottom-up watering going to reduce the amount of fungus that can build up on the top?
Yes, that also helps. When you're not watering from the top, you are. It's also that much more of a decrease of the chance of getting mold. But there's no guarantee because you're still keeping this wet, warm environment, right? So
that brings up one more question.
sure.
When you have a bed depth of, say, 3 inches, and you're watering from the bottom up, about what depth would you like to see the moisture?
I don't understand the question.
You want, well, with the soil, because depending upon the size of the seed, you have variable depth that you're planting them at, right? So you want
I
to.
get it now.
Basically want the seed in the moisture.
The seed needs to be wet. So whatever that water is going to
But
be.
you also said something about the seed being buried too deep.
Yes. But a lot of times, say, most seeds, like that we're talking about, are actually going to need surface to 1/8 of an inch of soil. So not a lot of soil. So that whole seed tray cell needs to be wet. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Does that answer your question?
No, I
Okay.
got it.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, let me talk really quick about containers.
No,
No? You want to talk about
no, I
containers?
don't want to talk about containers.
All right. So there are very things like that you can do. There are various ways you can do. You can buy these. You can repurpose. Like these are, I had violas in them at one point, and I just reused them. You can also use. I couldn't find it, but I have a little wooden. It's almost like a dowel, but it has a handle, and you can wrap newspaper around them. You can YouTube this. You can look it all over and figure out how to. There are easy ways to learn how to do newspaper pots. You don't even have to have the little wooden thing that I use to make wood. You can use it around a cup. You can use it around a dowel. Use it just to make circular pots, and it's really easy to do that. The other one of my favorites here, and I mentioned is
The only downside to the newspaper, so the newspaper pots, people will take the pot itself and just plant it directly into the ground. Mm-hmm. At least in our experience, like they don't decompose as fast as people think that they do. So oftentimes you're getting the plant root bound. So if you're going to use the newspaper pots, I would take the plant when it's ready to be transplanted outdoors. Take it out of the newspaper pot, chuck the newspaper in your compost pile, and then just put that plant directly into the soil.
That's a good point. And you don't have to take it all the way off if you have roots actually growing through the newspaper, which can happen. Just kind of break it up a little bit so that plant can break it up. You and then you.
Speaking of planting them outdoors, how do you, when you read seed packets, they never tell you, okay, when it's 4 inches for this plant or 2 inches for this plant. How do you know when to plant it outdoors?
That's a great question, and I think I skipped over that. But usually the rule of thumb is once it has 2 true leaves, right? Anytime after that. So you have the cotyledon, right? That's just your seed that's opened up and broken up, and you have it on each side. Then you have the next one. The next set would be true leaves, and then you have another set of true leaves that would come up. That's when you start hardening things off, which we have not talked about hardening off, so we should get to that too.
Right. But it also depends on the weather too, because if you have 2 sets of true leaves, but it's still 29 degrees outside.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's not time yet. But you can cover things like we've talked a little bit about.
Yeah.
Some people say it is. I don't know. I wouldn't eat it. But I guess it breaks down, right? I mean, I use cardboard, and that has ink on it too. So I've never. Egg cartons, yeah, and they will break down. But again, kind of break it up a little bit before you put it in the ground. What was your question?
And the 2 true leaves doesn't apply to what is not recommended ones where you just want a little root and then you plant it?
Yeah, no, it applies to all of them. So those ones that I'm showing here that say that I talk about stratification, you're still going to plant them in a seed tray. You just have to do things for the seed to open up. And once that seed opens up, then I take little tweezers because my fingers just can't get that small, and then I put them in each of the cells. And then once they have 2, I'm glad you asked, so that made sense. So that makes sense to you. Yeah, and then once it has 2 true leaves, then I start hardening it off. I saw another hand. Yes.
We were talking about the ink being possibly affecting the plant.
Uh-huh.
What other chemicals that are out there? My first thing is what's in the water. And there's a lot of things in water, because I'm involved in water as well, that affect a lot of things. Fluoride, chlorine,
Salts, yeah.
whatever TDSs are in that water.
Yeah, and I didn't talk.
Those affecting the plant.
They are.
Yeah, no, I didn't go all the way into it in the water, but a lot of times, well, first of all, plants like water a little bit acidic.
You want to finish containers, then we'll get to the water, and hopefully the water
Bouncing
answers
all
your
over.
question.
All right, so the other thing is soil blockers. So this is another one that doesn't use any plastics or papers that I really love. However, there is a trick to learning what kind of soils will hold these up. All you do is you take your mixture, you get it really wet and ready to plant, and then you take this and you put it into there and you push it down, and then these molds will make seed pots. So they call it a soil blocker is what the thing is called, because it makes these blocks. And it's kind of cool. This is the bigger size. I think this is the 2-inch.
Yeah, it's the bigger size.
But you can buy even like 1/2 inch that will sit down into the larger sizes and build up. So first of all, this is great because it doesn't disturb roots, right? So then you're not messing with roots. You're not using any kind of other products, plastics or papers or anything else that you might need. And then you can also stack them. So I'll get just a tray like this one, but without the plastic cells in it. and I'll just squirt them in there and then push them. So if you wanted to try this, you can buy those online. I don't think they sell them here at Warner's. But then I gave you a recipe here that says Elliot Coleman soil blocker. He's a big proponent. He's a main farmer of these soil blockers. And so that's a recipe that helps, because really what you need is something that'll hold together, right? Because it's so depressing to me sometimes when I don't get my soil mixture right and then I've used these and then they start to like fall apart when they're getting watered and they don't stay together. So the mixture has got to be just right for those. That's the only downside to those. Otherwise, they're amazing. It's less transplant shock because I can just take each square and I plant them in the ground. So I do love that thing. All right, and then back to water. So watering with rainwater is best if you can water with rainwater. Granted, there's some bacteria going in there, but it's also a lot purer. It's little more acidic, which the plants love, and you're not getting all the salts. If you do with tap water, that's okay. If you do water with tap water, that's okay. If you start to see a crust of that like white crust from the salts, flush it. Do like we talked about, watering from the bottom up, and put it in a barrel of good water, and then it'll flush it out. You know, let it soak up all that, and should give. Anything you want to add to that?
So city water, if you use municipal water, you know, our city, at least the city, says that the pH is 7.5. I've measured it and I get about 8. So they keep it purposely alkaline so it doesn't corrode the whole distribution system, because if it was acidic, you would corrode the pipes. So, you know, some of the things that you can do if you have to use municipal water, you can correct the pH on it. When I water my citrus trees using the municipal water, I actually put a little bit of distilled vinegar in there to bring the pH down and make it a little more acidic, because citrus trees like a more acidic environment. So again, one of the things to learn about your different plants and your seeds, reading about them, is some like a more alkaline environment and some like a more acidic environment. So you have to learn which ones like that. For example, you know, you can buy blueberries at all the nurseries around here. Blueberries will not grow in our soils here because our soils are alkaline. And blueberries like a soil that's about 3 to 3.5 on the pH scale. So they're like a very acidic soil. So just learning those things about the plants, the requirements, because what happens is that the pH isn't just right, your plant ends up not taking up the nutrients. And so then they start to suffer from nutrient deficiencies, and you look at it like, what's going on? I'm watering it, I'm doing all this. Well, it can't, you know, you can fertilize it all you want, but it can't actually take up that fertilizer because it's not the right pH for it. So learning those things will help. But you know, if you're not harvesting rainwater now, get yourself a barrel and start harvesting rainwater, and just use the rainwater. That's the best to water with. The city, you know, will give free rain barrels out. You got to get your name on the list, and you have to watch a presentation about it. But you can't, and it's a long wait list to get on that. But you know, you can get those. Lonnie?
Does it help to run your water and leave it sit out?
You can, and what that'll do is the chlorine will come out of it. Most of the time, you know, some people will say let it sit overnight. It has to sit for 24 hours. Honestly, most of the chlorine comes out of the water pretty quick. So even if you let it sit for just a couple of hours, most of that chlorine is gone and out of it.
But it doesn't change the pH.
No, the pH is still going to be the same. What's that? So an ideal pH, I mean, if you were to choose a pH for all of your plants, like ideally neutral to slightly acidic, but that's where it gets to what does the individual plant need. You know, if I was to take, using the blueberry example again, if I was to take the blueberries and water them with water that's 7 pH, it's better than watering it with the water that's got a pH of 8, but they like a lot more acidic than that. So it's just learning those different plants and learning what their needs are.
How about water from rain barrels coming off of, or rain coming off of asphalt?
I use it all the time. I mean, I know with some of the schools that want to get grants and things like that for doing that, there are specific requirements that will say, well, if it's rain coming off of an asphalt roof, then we don't want to, you know, do that because it could bring stuff with it. You know, if it's a really old asphalt roof that's corroding, then yeah, maybe I wouldn't use that. But I use the water off of our asphalt roof, and I don't worry about it. And I don't think any of our plants have suffered because of it.
Well water and compost tea.
Are good. What's that? It depends on what you're starting at. So another good tool for every gardener to have is a pH meter. What's that? It was around using well water and compost tea and adjusting the pH of the well water. So, you know, all well waters are different, different dissolved solids into them, different calcium levels. So a good tool for every gardener to have is a good pH meter, because it's going to vary depending upon the different waters. Because I could measure my well water and your well water, and they can come out completely different. So I would encourage you just to do that. And compost tea is great. Everybody knows what compost tea is. You take compost, soak it in water, and then take all that water and you water with that, and it's got all these great nutrients and microbes and everything in there that the plants really like and need.
Okay, we're out of.
I would do it with aged manure, not with fresh manure. Fresh manure can get really, really a lot of nitrogen in there, and you can burn your plants. You could dilute it if you wanted to, but just be aware that you're going to need to, with fresh manure, you'll need to dilute it.
Do you happen to know what the Kachina is well water? Do you happen to know what this is?
I don't know what Kachina's well water, what the pH is.
Yeah, get a meter and check it out. Let us know.
Yeah.
Ballpark.
So neutral is 7. Anything above 7 is alkaline. Anything below 7 is acidic.
And most vegetables, for a frame of reference, like their soil to be 6.4 to 6.8.
So slightly
So
acidic.
slightly acidic, right? So just as a reference. Okay, we're out of time, but there's a couple things that I really wanted to say really quick, and then, sorry, Lonnie, I'm going over. But usually I didn't tell you how many seeds to put in a cell. I usually put anywhere from 2 or 3. You could do 1, but when I do 2 or 3, what I find is that when some germinate and not others, like you can see there's an empty one there, then I can get a little wedge in there, a pencil or a paintbrush. I always have a little paintbrush. And I wedge one out and I put it in that empty cell. So then I just have a little extras, right? If you don't want to do that, then thin. Sorry, I hate thinning, but you have to thin things sometimes, especially carrots and things like that. Otherwise, root vegetables, it doesn't work if you don't thin them. Carrots don't transplant, unfortunately. But other things like that, feel free to. Now, are we out of time, Lonnie? Or go ahead.
Just the one thing on that is don't be like really dainty with them when you're thinning them or separating them out. Be brutal with them.
It makes them stronger.
It does actually.
Or kills them.
It's really good, or kills them. It's really good for them. There's a great book that Michael Pollan wrote. I think it's called On the Education of a Gardener. There's a section that he talks about. And it's like really good gardeners know that I'm just going to rip that thing out of there as much as I think it's going to hurt it. It's going to make that plant better. So when you're transplanting them, when you're like Jackie said, you've got like 3 of them going in there. She'll often just take that cell, instead of thinning them, separate them all out. And believe it or not, most of the time they survive, and they're better off for it.
The stems get stronger, actually. Are we out of time, or does anyone want to talk still? Or we can stay if someone wants to come and talk about specific varieties.
Did you cover everything?
I covered everything. If not, they can read their paper. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And if you give us a good review, you
should
get
stop?
$2
Okay.
off the coffee.
He's lying.
If you want to stay and chat with them, fine, but.
Yeah, we'll end. But if you have specific questions, come and find us.
I have done.
12 to 14 hours?
12 to 14.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't say that.
And where can you get finished compost? Is there anywhere, does the city have it? I know some places.
You can buy bags of it here. You can.
There's no some local gardens might like it.
Forestdale Farm.
They sell their
I
compost.
think that Ryland sells his compost.
Okay.
Forestdale.
Unfortunately, we used to have this great place in town called Roots. but
Yeah,
it's
it's great.
How can I get hold of it?
Thank you so much.
If you remember, Good Works was do this.
Any other questions?
What do you do if you have, we have a lot of gooseberries and honey?
That's my office number.
Yeah.
What do you recommend?
Oh, gophers are my nightmare. I have a whole flower farm also in Cornville besides growing up here.
Yeah.
And they're awful to trash them out. I hate killing things, but that's all. And rabbits, you can actually do low fences. They will follow
Yeah,
inside
good.
and
Awesome.
jump in.
And if you like
So
honey,
low
don't say
fences.
honey.
Yeah, the jackrabbits. I know there's tall as coyotes, but for some reason they won't jump
Oh,
in.
that is good to know.
So as long as it's like knee length or higher.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Yeah, good luck with the gophers.
Oh, thank you.
I wish I had an answer myself.
I have a question about citrus.
Yeah.
I have a pumpkin tree
Okay.
that's probably 15, almost 20 years old.
Yeah.
My cousin was been trying to pick
Yeah,
from
yeah.
the front
So I used to
there's
be a
another
fox.
tree.
So
Don't do it.
I soak them and
Yeah.
take out
I don't know.
it's not
I
gonna
started
work.
them from
So
seeds.
most of your fruit trees and citrus trees are grafted.
And I
They're not
would
grown
guess
from
that they
seed.
need some stratification.
So if you grow them, the problem is if you grow them from
Yeah, so they
seed,
catch you from the
they won't be
irises.
true to the parent that you took them from. So
So
this is why, like, going back to like medieval times and even before, they would identify like,
But you know,
I really
do
like the
start
fruit off
really
of this tree.
from
So they would
seeds,
take a
this
cutting
might be
off of it
something
and
that
graft
you
it
can
onto a
touch
different
on
fruit stock
base and
and say that's how I'm going to create that exact same fruit
Sorry.
is by doing that instead of saving the seeds and planting.
Kind of a
Not,
physics question.
but if
In
you
like,
were to go
like
back,
an 8x2
it's because of all the
planter bed
hybridizations
in a
happening over the years.
greenhouse.
So,
I want to grow zucchini in
citrus,
that, just
there were
zucchini
like
in that 8x2
3 or
planter
4
bed.
original citrus.
How many seeds would I put in there?
Like, back then,
I mean,
so
I know I've had
the
zucchini
oranges
just
have
take over the
it
world.
was just
Like
very
one plant. So
four
did I put
specific
one seed
varieties,
in
but
there?
over the years,
2, 5,
we
10?
bred this with this and that with
Just to
that.
do
and
two, so
that,
that you
and
end up with
all these
not
different varieties
like
you have
not
to
an
plant.
empty mound or an empty
And
hole.
so in order to
But then
maintain
snip
you
off
have to
or pull
continue
out. If
grafting
you get
to
two
take the
seeds to
cutting off
germinate,
of
just
that
pull the other one
and
out. I know it's hard to do, but
anybody can do grafting.
Somebody must mean this right.
Yeah,
yeah,
if you
for
look
some
on
reason,
YouTube,
like
there's
3
plenty of
bothers
grafting
me to have to bend.
videos.
If I have
People
just
get
2, then
intimidated by it.
I only have to bend 1. I'm not. It doesn't
You might fail a few times at it.
And the
but,
trays,
you know, that's why you graft like 10 of them at a time.
breakdown trays, cardboard.
Oh, yeah, I meant to.
Yeah,
bring
no,
that
I
up,
wouldn't
too.
do that. I would just
Are these better?
just
They're
try grafting.
reusable.
They were usable.
And because if it gets soaked, I'm worried about because if they get soaked before I can plant them.
I just, honestly, I don't like them for the same reason the newspaper.
Okay.
They don't break down very well. The peacocks, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah,
Peacocks
yeah.
are the core.
Yeah,
The
cantaloupe
core
seeds.
might do better because the core seems
figure
to
out
break
what
down a little
varieties.
better. But if
I don't know
you
what
do use them,
Prescott's
which
growing
is fine
season
if
is. I
you
think
want
it's
to.
a little bit longer than ours. but
Because
probably
I
not.
plan on reusing them, so if I just get a bunch of these
Yeah, then
trays
I would just
and then just store them in the winter. Okay,
In the greenhouse.
And I didn't talk about it, but when I reuse them, and it's on the paper though, I rinse these in 10% bleach before I reuse them.
So you need to get
I
like
get
some
them in a water
beds or
bath
something
and I
like that
just
in there.
scrub them a little bit. I don't even
Yeah,
like
so some
clean
beds
the
like,
dishwasher. I just
You know,
make sure
yay
that's
deep or something
just
like that,
covered.
so you have enough soil.
And that helps with the bacteria.
And then it just
If you
starts
want to
new
grow them
again,
in
and then it's
the
time.
greenhouse a whole
Okay,
year,
perfect. Thank
or
you
you
so
want to
much.
do-
Yeah, it's good. Thank you.
I'm
Okay,
so
well in that
smart
case, you know,
now.
just like we're talking here, like you can start them in something like this.
Sure.
You know, find a kennel variety that you either like or you know it's got the right number of days to maturity.
Sterilization.
They do most models do
I might have
like
missed
heat,
it. Did you
more
mention
heat
anything
and
about
peroxide, so that's
diluted
great. So
peroxide
it's hotter.
spray?
No, but I know people do that. You can do that. I was
But
on
you can-
online. I've never
Yeah,
used it.
so you can just do something like this. With it being a greenhouse, you don't have to worry about light.
I
because
just
it's
started,
light
and
from
I'm
the
like,
greenhouse.
the plant's there, and I'm like,
Does
is
it
it
get,
fixing
I
the
guess,
plant?
does it
Yeah,
get
so
enough
I would
light
look and see.
into
I bet
it
it's the
from-
ones.
Is it like a bunch of trees
But I
around
would
it, or?
check online to see if I were.
Okay, perfect.
Just so that you don't.
Well, I know that people
And then he mentioned the year
not
well.
you need like a
and
minimum of
something
8
the
hours
other
of
one
light
said
on them to
same
really be
size I bought.
effective.
I have a 15 by
But yeah, it's this exact same thing is all you would need to do.
Yeah.
Start it in that. Don't worry about the lights.
working good.
When it comes to the
I can't.
heat, you might want to try heat mat just
I have
because
a
of the
little
lights.
barn-like heater thing in there because I bought like a $200 garden.
Or, and you might want to cover it at night too, just so it maintains that warmth. Because you get that cycle, cold
So
one,
I
cold one,
can't
it's going to slow
keep
down
it
the germination rate. If you keep it
55.
that consistently warm all the
It
time,
goes
it'll
way
germinate a
below
lot faster.
on max.
And I'll just give you a jump start on
I'm
growing
like,
the plant.
So we put ours on a
Yeah, you're welcome.
thermostat, so if it dropped below 55,
Yeah.
then it should on. But we would also use these covers on these seedlings themselves.
Okay.
So then that would add another
Thank you.
10 degrees.
Thank
So
you.
it
I
would be
blueberries for years, and now I know why they didn't grow.
Right?
And I was
And
never
even that
motivated enough to when I'm research. They just would die. I'm like the seedlings.
So what you can do, a trick you
grown
can
in
do,
the house.
is if you get like buy a big
Transition
bale
for
of
a
peat
couple
moss,
hours every day.
cut
Then
some
get 'em
hole, cut a
outside
hole on
in
top
the
of it,
greenhouse,
and then
which
cut a few drainage holes at the bottom, bury that whole thing, plant the plant directly into that.
I do temperature thing.
Right. Well, if you ever want to try it again, if you do that, then you can actually be
If it's
successful.
still 20, I usually will brought mine in and did things.
Local raspberries that I put up.
If it's getting in the 30s, I know it's painful.
Yeah.
But if it's 30, and you can also double these up.
Yep,
So
yep.
if you did two,
So, but anyway, thank you so much. This was great
Yeah,
this
you're
morning.
welcome.
Okay, because I have tons of trees.
yeah, then you could do that. But there's always a risk, right, that something's going to freeze.
Right.
We would plan out, we had also, besides our greenhouse, we had a 40-foot hoop house in Jody Park. And
and we would plant out in April. But we would go every night, and we would cover everything, double layers.
Yeah, you guys are hard workers.
No, yeah,
I
Morning
just
evening ritual.
filled up 4 25-gallon water
that'll help.
containers, and I'm going to try some fish heaters in there,
Okay.
aquarium heaters. I'm just desperate to try to extend my season.
Paint, if you paint the water tank black, because it'll
The
absorb
blue.
more light. So paint them black, and they'll absorb more light and water.
She's getting down to 20 degrees.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's not going that low. Okay.